Good afternoon, everybody. I am Asaf Ramarowski, and it is my pleasure to welcome you once again to our SPME webinar series. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to my friend and colleague, Michal Cotler-Wunsh. She is Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Antisemitism. She's been a prominent public speaker, author, researcher, independent policy and strategy advisor on issues regarding anti-Semitism, law, human rights, and Zionism. She served in the 23rd Knesset. Her extensive bio is listed on the invitation, so I won't go into the weeds and all of that. But really, Michal is a prolific researcher and public policymaker on all the issues pertaining to the topics that we deal with. Above all, it's also important related to our conversation this afternoon. She was the one who co-founded the Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism, and she gave her a big task this afternoon to try to unpack and deal with the rising tide of anti-Semitism post-October 7th. Those of you who've been with us in the past will know Michal will talk for about 25 minutes or so. Then we will go into Q&A. Q&A will be via the chat. If you have questions, please type them in. We encourage you to ask as many as possible. If we don't get to all your questions in advance, I apologize. Please email us after the show and we'll be able to respond in a timely fashion. So really, Michal, without further ado, it's great to have you on the show, and the virtual floor is now yours. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Asaf, for having me on, and thank you for everybody who's here to talk about what I believe is actually a critical subject at an existential moment. And I don't like to be overly dramatic, but I'll try and maybe share with you some of my analysis and hopefully be able to relate to you why I believe it is an existential moment. And on the other hand, why I do think that there are many opportunities that we have to identify and realize in order to be able to face the existential nature of the moment. So the understanding in many ways, and Asaf referred a little bit to my own sort of intersection with combating anti-Semitism. I'll share with you that I was appointed as Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism about 3 weeks before 10/7. And you will hear me referring to the massacre, burning, abduction, rape, murder, and burning of entire families that took place on the 7th of October on 10/7. And I do so intentionally because, like 9/11, I very much believe that we cannot imagine going back in any capacity, in any of the way we conduct ourselves, to the day before 10/7. 10/7 changed the world, not only for the state of Israel, not only for Jews around the world, but changed the world in the sense that it brutally ripped off masks, multiple masks, to which many people might not have been privy. So having been appointed to Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism just weeks before 10/7, and now as a member of a coalition of special envoys from around the world, and we should note that many countries appointed special envoys in the years leading up to 10/7 because of this constant increase and rise in the scourge of anti-Semitism. It is not a surprise, and what we see has been percolating and festering and bubbling, perhaps just below the surface for some people, but in fact, of course, explosively apparent with the brutal ripping off of the multiple masks. And the multiple masks that I will speak to in the next 20 minutes, and then hopefully be able to have the chance to drill down on what interests those of you that are here, I'll concentrate on 3 areas, on 3 fronts, if you will, or battle fronts, where the war has been raging for decades. And some of us, those of us that have been on the front lines of identifying and combating anti-Semitism on some of those battle fronts, perhaps in echo chambers, might not have been aware of the intersection between them. Part of what makes 10/7 an existential moment and the responses to 10/7 a call to action and urgency is actually the intersection between those battlefronts. And I'll share the 3 battlefronts as I see them in this unconventional war for public opinion that has been raging for decades. The first front being the international institutions, international law and human rights, the mechanisms, the values, the infrastructure created, the organizations, if you will, the UN itself, UNRWA, of which we're very familiar with more and more, those of us that didn't realize in the decades that have passed what a hindrance to any possibility of resolution, UNRWA is basically born in sin. So the UN, UNRWA, the ICJ, and where I'd like to begin my sort of analysis of how we got there in the international institutions is with the 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution passed in the UN. So Soviet propaganda passed in the UN in 1975, we're talking decades ago, alive and well in the name of progress on the second battlefront that I'd like to be able to refer to, and that is the university campus space. And Zionist, and Zionism is racism, Zionist as replacing, or if you will, as coding Jew on the third front that I'd like to be able to refer to, and that is the social media front. So again, the international institutions and all of its long arms or short arms or mechanisms and the values that it was created to uphold, promote, and protect equally and consistently. That's one front. The second front, the university campus space. The third front is the social media, not just platforms, but reality in which 10/7 occurs. So I'll start with the international institutions and what I believe actually began with a systematic co-opting and weaponization of the foundational principles of international law, of the human rights that in the aftermath of World War II became the mechanism to ensure that never again, and the understanding that that prospective commitment, never again in the future, because we cannot prevent the past, never again in the future depended on upholding, promoting, and protecting those foundational principles by the infrastructure, the organizations, the mechanisms entrusted to do so, the UN being the overall sort of umbrella branch of it, and understanding that after a series of conventional wars between 1948, in which Jews, a prototypical indigenous people that speak the same language Hebrew, traverse the same land Israel, read the same book, the Bible, practice the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. And I say indigenous because indigeneity was perhaps the first word or concept, if you will, that was co-opted and weaponized against Jews. Indigeneity, that indigenous people, returned to our ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution with a commitment to equality. That mouthful is not me. That is Israel's Declaration of Independence, Ben Gurion, if you will, at the time, and the understanding that that is the vision, mission, values of this country. From 1948 to 1973, in a series of what I would call conventional wars, where armies around the state of Israel committed to its annihilation, to its eradication, to its destruction, engage in that conventional warfare and fail, there is an acknowledgement of that failure. And in my sort of analysis, there is also an understanding that there is another form, an unconventional war that can be waged and that may take longer, but in fact, we are now seeing the sort of manifestations of, very clear manifestations of. One being, or the primary one, when I focus on the UN being, the UN resolution, Zionism is racism, 1975, peddling Soviet propaganda or echoing Soviet propaganda that's been around for decades and was around then, and that is going to be a continuum, and meeting us in 2024 university campuses in the form of not only a Zionism racism, but in a more libelous form, because the next sort of milestone that I'll point to is the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism. And I'm sure, though I can't see you, that I'm speaking to scholars that are fully aware of the understanding that that 2001 Durban, South Africa, Conference Against Racism turns into an anti-Semitic hate fest. An anti-Semitic hate fest where those that participate in, some of whom I know personally, perhaps for the first time become keenly aware that it is their life's mission, that is of human rights, that has been co-opted and weaponized to demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the state of Israel. And what I just described, those 3 Ds, are the very mechanism that invariably enabled the mutation of anti-Semitism over time, that invariably enable the lethal strain of which we see today, but also enabled the atrocities of the Holocaust, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards. Whereas perhaps the traditional form of those 3 Ds, of that Jew hatred, was against the individual Jew who was barred from an equal place in society. Well, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards applied to the proverbial Jew among the nations, that is the state of Israel, barred from an equal place in the family of nations, of which it was intended to be an equal member, that is precisely the mechanism that enables that mutation of anti-Semitism. And so at that 2001 Durban conference against racism turned anti-Semitic hate fest, that leads to what is known today as Israel Apartheid Week at every single campus. And here you may see where I'm going with the intersection of the battlefronts of every single campus that holds an Israel Apartheid Week. We are now marking 23 years of Israel Apartheid weeks on campuses across North America and other places around the world. Israel Apartheid Weeks that are marked, that take place on all of the campuses in which we have 23 years of graduates that are now in Congress, in parliaments, in corporations around the world that are, in fact, certain that Zionism is racism, 1975 UN resolution turned reality in the campus. Israel is an apartheid state, and there is nothing to do with an apartheid state but to dismantle it. And fast forward to 10/7, and perhaps the most Orwellian inversion in that moment of co-opting and weaponizing the foundational principles, the mechanisms, the terminology that was created, that was to be upheld equally and consistently so that never again. And I imagine you all know where I'm going. I'll just say, with that 10/7, fueled by the very same anti-Semitism in all of its forms, that actually the responses to 10/7, to the war crimes, to the crimes against humanity, by a genocidal terror organization that in its charter is openly committed and states its intent to annihilate the state of Israel and murder Jews, having a final solution 82 years after the Wannsee Conference. Well, in that 10/7, it is the responses that are silent in the international institutions, Me Too, unless you're a Jew, no women's organizations, no children's organizations, that deny not just days or weeks after 10/7, even as the barbaric savages perpetrating the atrocities of 10/7 are live streaming what it is that they did or what it is that they were doing on Telegram. Denial sets in that justify around the world Hamas genocidal terrorists in the atrocities perpetrated on 10/7, barbaric atrocities that the Jewish people have not suffered since the Holocaust, and unfathomably that attack Jews around the world, on campuses, on the streets, in social media, and in international institutions. And here we are at the most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law in the long process of the co-opting and weaponizing of international institutions and of their values and of the principles that they were created and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect equally and consistently. And that is, of course, the co-opting and the weaponization of the Holocaust itself, of genocide, of which we just marked 75 years to the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Genocide that was coined by Raphael Lemkin to describe the atrocities of the Holocaust, too terrible to imagine, but not too terrible to have happened. And that convention itself is weaponized by none other than South Africa, who has in fact hosted the perpetrators of a current genocide that is in Darfur, who has hosted Hamas leaders that perpetrated the genocide of 10/7, and weaponizes that very convention against the state of Israel at yet another institution that has been co-opted and weaponized, the International Court of Justice. And we've just seen not only South Africa's allegations, but Israel's response. Once again, Israel seated on the dock of the accused. I will say in this systematic Orwellian inversion that it was a moment in which, in many ways, watching Israel's defense and Israel's response to the preposterous allegations that what for all other countries, and if we liken it to all other individuals, it is self-defense. For the state of Israel, it is genocide. And understanding that for the first time, perhaps, we are watching the state of Israel at the ICJ as it responds to South Africa's preposterous allegations, rise from the docket of the accused. Understand that in this unconventional war for public opinion that has been raging for decades, we are very far along. And that Zionism has turned into racism, according to those that believe that blood libel, that Israel is deemed or akin to an apartheid state, and that now we have come to the most Orwellian version of them all, and that is that Israel is perpetrating a genocide. And you can imagine the Orwellian understanding that those that suffered a genocide would be the most terrible individuals, community, country, people, if they are able to perpetrate the horrors of the Holocaust on another population. And so if I transition into the university spaces, and in many, many senses, because I was appointed just weeks before the war, I had been in this, and you could, I guess, hear it in my voice, although this sense of urgency has actually been a part of what I do because I'm at the forefront of this for so many years, but has led in many ways to the engagement with my own doctoral research that was about the regulation of speech on university campuses. Much, much, much before DEI infrastructure was created, when speech codes were just beginning to develop, trigger warning, safe spaces, microaggressions, leading us to where we are in an intersection of processes actually that expose themselves, with another mask being brutally removed on 10/7, into spaces in which, university spaces, academic spaces, in which, in just the same way of the double standard in application of principles, we see that DEI infrastructure, well, it applies to everybody, except the DEI officers themselves don't know, or maybe are a part of the systematic anti-Semitism that actually excludes, not inclusion, excludes David, who happens to be a Jew, excludes Sally, who happens to self-define as a Zionist, and excludes Fred, who just believes that Israel has a right to exist. And so we have moved into this moment of reckoning, which in academic spaces result in these unbelievable demonstrations. I can share with you anecdotally that I just came back from Stanford last week, in which the chants were more than I've heard in the past, in the sense that it wasn't just echoing Hamas charter from the river to the sea, from the north to the south, a call to annihilate the state of Israel, which, by the way, was projected on George Washington University Library a week after 10/7, alongside Glory to Our Martyrs. No, the calls last week on Stanford were we don't want no Jew state, we want all of 48. If that is not bad enough, then it was Zionist, you can't hide, we charge you with genocide. And so if we follow the equation of Zionism equals racism, Israel's an apartheid state, Israel perpetrates a genocide, the sign next door to the Hillel house read in big letters, Zionism equals genocide. And here we are at a process where on campuses across North America and in other places in the world as well, we have, under the umbrella of a DEI infrastructure, actually enabled or been silent to the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards against the individual Jew, barring him or her from an equal place in society, right back to that traditional anti-Semitism, of course, inextricably linked with or correlated with an affinity to Israel. And what is actually unbelievable when I engage university presidents, provosts, and chancellors in this moment of reckoning is the understanding that it is a challenge for the universities themselves. It is a looking glass through which the universities themselves have to engage in their own mission. Because if their mission is to teach people how to think, when in fact what we see is a generation inculcated by professors who claim to be exhilarated on 10/7, by students and professors who actually disrupt my lectures about anti-Semitism with demonstrations that are anti-Zionism, who are unable to or incapable of or unwilling to engage with ideas with which they disagree, and who live just fine with a selective application of principles to all, except for those that they choose to exclude. It just happens to be Jews/Zionists/supporters of the state of Israel. And I just want to say, so that I don't take all of our time and have more time for questions, that I would be remiss if I didn't mention the intersection with the social media reality, where I believe the explosive nature or the other battlefront that we have to pay attention to. This is the first what I believe is on the cusp of a global war, because as we know, Hamas is but one proxy of a genocidal, murderous Islamic regime in Iran that is absolutely fighting a war by proxy, including at the moment on Israel, from Hezbollah in the north and the Houthis from the Red Sea, and PIJ from Gaza alongside Hamas and others. But there is an intersection of authoritarian regimes, not just Iran, that is in many ways actually threatening the foundations of all of our democracies. That in fact, 10/7 marks the line in the quicksand, or the border in the quicksand, if you will, between barbaric savagery, the likes of which we witnessed on 10/7 and quickly forgot, hence the quicksand. And some of us quickly forgot, not all of us. For us in Israel, this has been one never-ending day since 10/7, 118 days of one day, with everybody in many ways implicated in the tragedy of 10/7 on that day, and since that day, with our own children on the battlefront and the entire Israeli population deployed to this war. But where we are just the front lines of this war, I believe it is very clear that the line in the quicksand is between barbarism and civilization itself. And we are just on the front line. So if we are on the cusp of a very, very daunting prospect of a very global nature, then we would be remiss if we didn't understand the extent of the challenge, the existential nature of the challenge, and the fact that it is the first time that it will be fought in a social media reality, in which very bad agents are able to use the social media reality using memes and hashtags. And we know it, and Asaf mentioned that I founded an Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism as a legislator. This intersects with many other issues. And we as legislators and we as societies are asking social media platforms all the wrong questions. The understanding that we have not created transparency mechanisms in a business model that actually creates polarization and fragmentization with everything that I have just said, and can be utilized in ways that actually enables, much like terror, to sow fear, distrust, and despair in our societies in that social media reality. Well, we see that too. If we zoom in on a post-10/7 and a pre-10/7 reality, the post-10/7 reality shows us very clearly that where on the streets in many countries around the world, there are hundreds of percentages in increase of anti-Semitic attacks, and we know they are underreported. Online, we're in the thousands of percentages, where Zionist literally is used to replace the word Jew, including the supreme leader of Khamenei that days before 10/7 called to destroy the Zionist cancer that is Israel by the Palestinians, and continues thereafter, but many, many others. And so there is another element, I would say, of this unconventional war for public opinion very much raging online. We have to know that, and many of you are probably familiar with the 52%, according to Harvard Hoover, 52% of Gen Z that do not believe that the state of Israel has a right to exist. Alongside that, they believe a lot of other things, including bin Laden's letter to America, circulated on TikTok days after 9/11, after 10/7, and just like in the post-10/7 responses that deny, that justify, that support, and attack Jews in the wake of 10/7, bin Laden's TikTok letter to America, disseminated among the millions of Gen Z users, probably more than millions, 16 to 24-year-olds, is actually received in the same way, with justification, support, and the attack of Jews in a post-9/11 reality. And so we meet, in what I believe is really an existential moment in the intersection between the multi-fronts that this war has been raging. And all of these fronts are the unconventional fronts in which Israel at the moment is extremely, extremely overtaken with very little bandwidth for the additional battlefronts, if you will, because the conventional front is taking up all the possible energy, not just in Gaza, but as you know, from the north, and as you know, from the Red Sea, and in many ways, that unconventional war for public opinion. And I try to make this accessible, in my trips across North America. I've also met with Jewish leadership and non-Jewish leadership that recognizes that this is a critical moment, an existential moment for civilization, and understands that it is our responsibility to actually transcend and reach across difference in order to be able to battle not just this rise in anti-Semitism, this tsunami of anti-Semitism, but knowing that it is predictive and where, what we always, that good old adage is back again, where we may be the bloody canary in the mine shaft will collapse. And in that sense, that is not just an existential moment, but it is a call to action to all of us to be boots on the ground, not only in Israel, and not only if we are Jews, but in fact, if it is the civilization, our shared civilization, shared values of life and of liberty that we believe are under assault. We have parliamentarians not running in the UK because they are being so violently harassed and intimidated. We have individuals on the streets of LA like Paul Kessler, say his name, who was killed holding an Israeli flag in a demonstration post 10/7 in support of Israel. And of course, we have the multiple spaces and places in which anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks and harassment are raging, including the university spaces, the online spaces, and the streets. And it is our call to action. So I'm grateful for your time, and I'm open to discussing any questions that may be interesting to those that are here in order to be able to drill down. Thank you very much, Asaf.
Great. Thank you, Michal. Thank you for that in-depth and really survey of what we're seeing out here, which, obviously many of us who have been on the front lines in the States have been seeing on the campuses as we're watching all of this. Let me start off by a first question, and then, I know Alex has a question, and then we'll go to the audience. But we've been observing a lot of schisms, obviously, in the American Jewish community, the role of Zionism, obviously all amplified by what we've been seeing. And you've been talking correctly about what we've been seeing, the outrageous stuff outside and how much Hamas in America and around the world is as passionate and committed to the Hamas narrative as you see on the ground itself. Are you seeing now a kind of a post October 7th understanding inside of Israel that there is a better understanding of what we've been facing for all these years as far as the fight? Because Israelis, fortunately, don't have the opportunity to deal with anti-Semitism in their faces all the time. Are you seeing a better understanding now? SPME at large was started because of the boycott on campuses 20-some years ago on European campuses. It took Israel a little bit of time to understand the depth and the threats. Today we have and I think it was Brett Stevens in one of his columns coined the phrase, kind of October 8th Jews, people waking up to the reality. Are you seeing a similar kind of reality or kind of understanding inside of Israel these days?
So first of all, absolutely, I agree with you that Israel not only didn't know what anti-Semitism was, it didn't know that it concerns the state of Israel, meaning the existential nature, the understanding that it is another war front and that anti-Semitism actually, we misnamed terror as terror. The motivation for terror is anti-Semitism. And in many, many ways, I think that 10/7, when you think of even the geography that was hit on 10/7, the kibbutzim and the moshavim, Vivian Silver, the 72-year-old Canadian-Israeli peace activist who was so brutally murdered, it took 5 weeks to identify her remains. We have peace activists that were driving Gazan children to Israeli hospitals regularly. The understanding for Israelis that they were targets because they were Jews, and that all those non-Jews who were murdered because they happened to be in Israel, the Jewish nation state, is one that I don't think can be forgotten. It is a moment of understanding, but we have to be very clear, Asaf. It's why I keep saying many masks were brutally ripped off. But that means that all of us that have been in the front lines for a long time and identify what we see, we have an increased responsibility to make that accessible and to connect the dots. Meaning the understanding that for the first time, completely secular Israelis, self-defined secular Israelis, never identified as anything remotely other than Israelis, for the first time recognize that they are attacked because of their identity, and that identity is Jew or Zionist, very much intersects with a conversation that we need to be having with North American Jews that may not have defined as self-Zionists, or in fact, maybe they defined as anti-Zionists, except that their friends won't speak to them because they visited in Israel, or they have a cousin here for whom they're worried, or they know somebody who was murdered at the Nova Peace Festival and they care, or they cried in their university classroom. So we have this moment of understanding, I call it reclaiming Zionism. Reclaiming Zionism from that Zionism is racism, 1975 UN resolution. And you know, when I meet with university presidents, and this is true for Israelis too, the reclamation of our identity, saying, I am a Zionist, it is integral to my identity. For thousands of years, my people, which is a prototypical indigenous people, reclaiming that too in the discourse on North American campuses, that would deem me, if you are radical left, deem me as super white. But if you are alt-right, then you would deem me as Jews cannot replace us. You are never going to be white enough. Well, guess what? Neither are my story. So the imperative to reclaim identity, that transcends the borders of Canada, the United States, France, or Israel. The reclamation of identity at this intersection, and I'll say, knowing that 75 years ago, we returned to an ancestral homeland as an indigenous people, with half of us here and half of us in the rest of the world, and engaging in that conversation, recognizing that we are one side of the same coin, and that we have so much in common, and I would say the obligation for those of us that are not living in Israel to transcend and reach across other real and perceived differences of religion, of politics, of geography, for sure, of denomination, and the understanding that this is a moment of reckoning in all of those spaces, whether we turn the lens to the international institutions, to the university spaces, to the social media platforms, or to ourselves. The key actually becomes the reclamation of identity. When I speak, as I said, to those university presidents, and I say to them, Zionism is a progressive national liberation movement. It's about 140 years old. It far preceded the state of Israel, and it is anchored and based in the prayers and longing and yearning of my ancestors to return to Zion. I can't just shed that Zionist pound of flesh. Well, the same thing for Israelis. The ability to say to Israelis, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. It is that place to which an indigenous, prototypical indigenous people returned. And not only do my kids who were born in Canada have to know that they have peers in first grade in Israel, but first graders in Israel, they have to know that they have peers in first grade in Russia, in the United States, in Canada, in France, in Switzerland, around the world. So that understanding, I think, goes both ways, and really opening up the conversation to a two-way bridge that in many ways enables a much deeper conversation than we've had, and in many more ways actually makes clear that we are not done with this shared project that is the miraculous state of Israel, 75 years young. And 75 is very young for our country. In fact, we probably built the physical infrastructure of this shared project. But what 10-7 in many ways showed all of us is that it is critical that our generation lean in and build the next tier of this shared project, the values, the understanding of what it is that the Declaration of Independence is telling us. The nation state of an indigenous people returned after millennia of exile and persecution, committed to equality. What does that mean for the people, the Jewish people in general, for the people living in Israel, and for the people not living in Israel, but members of that members of that people not living in that country, forgive me. And yes, that was a very long answer to say, yes, I believe that there is a heightened understanding, and the word anti-Semitism all of a sudden can be heard, including in mainstream media. In fact, the fact that I exist as a role and I joined the coalition of special envoys, Israel was quite late to join. There are many other special envoys that were appointed long ago. I'm only Israel's second special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, and the first didn't serve for very long. And that understanding actually is now an additional call to action, including for involvement like SPMEs that has been on the forefront of this for decades and has an ability to make accessible what it is that the removal of masks has exposed, and most importantly, to connect the dots.
Great, thank you. And we are indeed here to help you whenever we can. Alex, I know you have a question before we go to the audience, so let me, why don't you come on camera?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much for a great presentation. And I have many questions, and I'll try and keep mine focused on the theme of masks off. And I think one of the many masks that has been revealed, at least here in the West, is the failure of all sorts of institutions. You mentioned the feminist movement, but I'll point to a couple of other kinds of phenomena. One is the rise of Arab street politics in the streets of America, rioting, and actually at this very moment, the beltway around Washington is completely stopped by hundreds of cars as part of a pro-Hamas protest. Yesterday, the city of Chicago, the city council passed a ceasefire so-called resolution. The mayor cast the tie-breaking vote. The question is, and these kinds of phenomena are replicated all over the place in failing institutions, in city government, in K through 12 education, in university education, institutions that have almost explicitly abandoned their missions and adopted a politics of deflection. So what does that mean for a combating anti-Semitism in the 21st century, for actual explicit political responses, and also for the idea of restoring, retrieving, sustaining identity, Jewish identity, Israeli Jewish, American Jewish, global Jewish relations?
So first of all, that removal of masks in response to 10/7, I think even for those of us in these spaces, the tsunami with which they hit, even for those of us that have been here for so long, couldn't have been it's not that it could have been predicted, but it's overwhelming. It washes over you. It's a tsunami, right? When I see students, screaming on Stanford campus, what they're screaming at me, and invariably there's a Jewish student in the front that says, I'm a Jew, I wish Israel would disappear, I hate Israel, then I understand how far gone we are, or that, 52% of Gen Z that doesn't believe that Israel has a right to exist. But this is what I want to say about that. In many ways, that failing is not visible just to us. In many ways, that failing is visible to all of those that are actually committed to liberal values, right? All of those people who are now experiencing for the first time somebody walking by a poster of a hostage, a 10-month-old, now year-old hostage, and ripping it off because that's not a human baby. Demonization, delegitimization, double standard. That's not a human baby. And if it is a human baby, he has no right to live. And if he has, in any ways, that's not like my baby, right? That could never happen to my baby. That is what's happening on the streets. And you have people turning around and looking and saying, this is not reasonable. Meaning the understanding that there is a jihadi Islamist ideology behind this, or a Marxist, communist understanding of, equity as opposed to equality. That's a whole other conversation that universities are engaged in and are going to have to engage in. But the bottom line is they undermine the foundations of democracies. This is not just about Jews. This is not just about the state of Israel. It's not just about anti-Semitism. This is about the basic foundations of our shared values of democracy, of the foundations of democracies, of what the United States and America stands for, an idea, right? The United States and Israel are both ideas. And in this war of ideas, there is a war on the idea of the foundations of democracy that is raging by an intersection of what we have named as Islamist, as radical left or woke, or whatever we want to define it as. But what 10/7 did and the responses to it was for people to look at 10/7 and burned families tied together and women raped so badly their legs can't be straightened for burial, and being able to say, that's not progress. That is not progress. That is regress. That's Middle Ages. And in that sense, I think that there are a lot of confused people, for sure, because everything that they thought they knew, including Jews, but including non-Jews, everything that they thought they knew until yesterday, including what social justice represents, it's not social justice. There is nothing but an unequivocal condemnation at 10/7 that anybody that is profoundly committed to liberal values, and that's why we see this sort of confusing, people are not understanding why some people who are devout Democrats are all of a sudden aligned with in Israel, right? I can imagine that there's questions about I know that there's questions about certain politicians in the United States not understanding and, of course, accusing them of the Jewish lobby, the Zionist lobby, paying them off and so on. So what I'm saying by that is it's not just the reclamation of Jewish identity, whether it's indigeneity or Zionism or the implication of being a people that is 16 million people large or small, that's it, being trapped or imposed on with a narrative that doesn't relate to us, meaning the division of the world between oppressed and oppressor, and us being the oppressor in this picture. How did that even happen? Reclaiming the identity that says, this is not my story, is not just our reclamation. It is the reclamation of all that stood at the forefront and believe in and have worked there tirelessly profoundly for liberal, small case liberal, because I'm a Canadian, values. And the reclamation of those values enables us, and I'm going to say, it demands that we create allyship and find the allies that exist and reach across difference in order to perhaps create new allies that recognize that this is the dismantling, the collapse of the foundations of democracies. Much like we said, double standards actually undermine the entire infrastructure in the UN or in the ICJ. They undermine the entire infrastructure in university spaces. If DEI, even if we were to keep DEI as is, and I usually say to university presidents, we can engage in a conversation about DEI, but I don't want to. I want DEI as long as it exists, until you figure it out, to apply equally and selectively, equally and consistently to all students, not selectively, right? If it doesn't, then double standards undermine the entire infrastructure, and they undermine the entire infrastructure in all of the contexts that you have mentioned. And yes, I guess an existential moment is an existential moment, and we are on the cusp of what could be the demise of the West as we know it. That is a call to action. The understanding that we as a Jewish people, my focus is anti-Semitism, the understanding that we as a Jewish people have half of us here, as I mentioned, in Israel, fighting in a very real way, but we also have half of us in the rest of the world in relative safety and security with a responsibility to fight wars, and in wars we lose friends. I say that to students. It's devastating to have to say to students. In war, we lose friends. We have buried more of our kids' friends and friends' kids than I've even begun to process, but that's where we're at. And on the other hand, we are, I'm going to say, for the Jewish people in terms of our history, at a historic first. Because 2024 is not 1944. We have a country, we have sovereignty, we have a defense force, half of us here, and we have relative safety with 6 million boots on the ground in the United States of America, with possibility, ability, and responsibility to fight to engage in this war. And you see more and more of it. And I think that a lot of people are waking up to it. And they in many ways need to be told what to do, because the first thing is shock. But I'm going to say again, organizations like SPME is a very good place to be able to, not only talk about things theoretically, but understand, for example, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition is the benchmark definition created post the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism. If the White House strategy does not adopt the benchmark definition of anti-Semitism that enables to identify and combat this strain of an ever-mutating virus, the one that presented itself, anti-Zionism, the negation of Israel's very right to exist in a post-10/7 world, if it doesn't do that, then the White House strategy will not be identifying and combating anti-Semitism comprehensively. Everybody's become a viral expert post-COVID. We understand that viruses mutate. If we only tackle the first strains of the virus and not the new strain of the virus, it's not very useful, because the new strain of the virus will continue to infect our spaces and places in society. And so the IRA working definition has to be utilized by universities, by police commissioners, by mayors, by the White House strategy, top down, bottom up, by school boards. And there we have not just a voice, but I'm going to say a responsibility to our kids to make sure that it's not enough to say what the UN hasn't done with never again, and never again is right now. If never again is right now, and we're able to identify this strain of anti-Semitism, then we're going to have to make that accessible in all of our spaces and places, in workplaces and corporations. And the IRA, the result of a long democratic process that's been adopted by more than 40 countries, more than 1,200 entities, is a very important place to start. The idea that Zionist is an identity when corporations or universities or social media platforms list protected characteristics on social media platforms or list protected identities in university, if I don't then make the necessary demand that Zionist is an identity, it's not a political statement. It's not a political statement. It's my identity. I can't just shed my Zionist pound of flesh and then demand that universities recognize it as an identity, like all other identities. Everybody gets to self-define. Well, so do I. Then we will be, in many ways, ignoring what it is that the responses to 10-7 exposed to democracies, to the Western world, and in that way, in that sense, will be in many ways, I would say, relinquishing the responsibility that we have, knowing what we know, having been at the forefront of this sort of decades-long process that enabled this tsunami.
Great, thank you. Alex, do you have a follow-up? I'm going to go to the audience.
I have many follow-ups, but we should move on and get some questions in. Thank you.
Great. All right, Michal. So there are a bunch. I want to try to combine them together, given the time constraints. But there are a few kind of common threads here that I'll try to kind of build on and ask and combine some of these questions. Going to your last point about DEI. DEI comes a lot about in the conversation. There has been of late, there was a big article that came out where the two former leaders of AJC and ADL saying, Harris and Foxman respectively, saying that DEI can't be fixed. We need to engage, kind of move away from that, given that the portfolio of anti-Semitism does indeed fall within the DEI officers, specifically in academic institutions. The younger generation, the new leaders are saying we can work within that confine and that construct, though, we've seen it, be the opposite. And that also, so I want your take on that. But secondly, I also, this is another thread that came up as a result of the Q&A, is really as a result of what we know to be true and as far as how this worldview is seen, how do we engage with the younger generation? The younger generation, which really looks at all of this, and you mentioned that before in your earlier remarks as far as the stat. I mean, younger Jews do not see, to your last point, that Zionism is part of their fabric of their Jewish identity. And correctly, we talk a lot about shedding Zionism, means shedding my Jewishness. They see it as separately, even after October 7th. So really, how do you tackle those two issues vis-a-vis DEI and the younger generation? I think that would, cover some of the points that were raised here.
So I'll start from the end and I'll say, look, we have a moment of reckoning of our own. So we, as Jewish communities that have spent a lot of time and energy and resources on Jewish education, but when I say to a space of students, I am a member, I said it here 3 times, I am a member of a prototypical Indigenous people. If they're Canadian or Australian, the first thing they do is say, you can't say that. And I say, no, I can, and I can prove it to you. I am a member of a prototypical Indigenous people that speaks the same language, Hebrew, and reads the same book, the Bible, and traverses the same land, Israel, and practices the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. That's what indigeneity means. And I, as a Jew, Judaism, or being a Jew, it's not just a religion. Jews are not just a religion. We have a religion. Jews are not just a culture. We have a culture. Jews are not just a country. We have a country. Jews are a people. Now, if we have kids that have gone through 12 years of Jewish education and camps and birthright, and they've never heard that sentence, then we have a moment of reckoning of our own. If I say to Jewish students, I am a Zionist, this is what Zionism is. It's the progressive national liberation movement of that prototypical Indigenous people that enabled our return to our ancestral homeland. The reason that I am a Zionist is because I believe in that right of the return of that people, but also because I am the granddaughter of grandparents that prayed and yearned and longed to return to Zion. And I now live in Zion. I can't just shed that Zionist pound of flesh. Now, you can choose to be an anti-Zionist, but you can't tell me that I can't be a Zionist, right? This is an age and an era. And actually, when I speak to younger students, this is mostly what I am able to convey, I think in the strongest sort of sense, is to talk about identity. Because when you talk about knowledge in a TikTok generation, that might be a little bit harder. But when you talk about identity, in an era where everybody gets to self-define their identity and nobody gets to impose their perception of their identity on you, then the moment that I have declared my Zionism as an integral to my identity and myself as a Zionist, just as in the past I would say I am a Jew, and just as in the past I would say Jews can be religious Jews, they could be non-practicing religious Jews, they could be secular Jews, they can be Zionist Jews. It happens to be that the majority of Jews still self-define as Zionists, and many non-Jews self-define as Zionists. It is unacceptable that we would deem that identity as illegitimate. That's like the sort of condensed answer to that. But I also want to say the educational piece in terms of the moment of reckoning that we have demands to interact with the DEI infrastructure in the way that I believe that the United States will have to look. As I said, my doctoral research was about the attempted regulation of speech initially when it began, and what I was curious about was how will this affect academic freedom? Now, here we are, right? First of all, there are billions of dollars being poured into academic settings or universities, American universities from foreign countries. We already know that the Qatari dollars, billions, have flown into, flowed into American universities. That's something to be wary of. But when you think of the regulation of speech adversely affecting academic freedom, and you don't contemplate for a moment how we got from diversity, equality, and inclusion to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Equality and equity do not mean the same thing, right? Measuring the results and ridding ourselves of meritocracy, equity says you and I should have the same thing. That is communism. That is not equality or equal opportunity. And that is a conversation that's antithetical to the foundational values of the United States of America. And I believe that that's going to be a place where Americans have, and I think that they are having, Bill Ackman's and so on, are having a deep conversation with what this means. And finally, is that the role of a university? Is not the role of a university to teach people how to think? If it's to teach people what to think, to indoctrinate them, then first of all, that's very scary. And second of all, we as parents, as students, as professors, have to decide if we're willing to play along and teach, meaning there's an element of personal responsibility here that says, okay, I want my kid to graduate from the best university, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, wherever else. Do I? If 3 university presidents in a hearing in Congress cannot tell you that calling for the genocide of Jews does not violate their code of conduct, and I want to say what was missing very much for me in that hearing, I actually briefed that education committee the next day and said this to them. The problem is, of course, the double standards. Can you call for the genocide of any other group on your campus without violating your code of conduct? If the answer is no, then you cannot call for the genocide of Jews without violating your code of conduct either at that university. And we should not, I think we'd be remiss if we think it's just about an individual university president or 3 university presidents or 3 universities. It's systematic, right? This is a long process that has actually created a space in which the pursuit of knowledge, I'm not even going to say truth, because we'll get into a whole discussion about that in a post-truth era, but the pursuit of knowledge for, I think we can all agree, is the role of universities, is clearly not being, at least in my view, is clearly not being upheld by the university spaces. And so that definitely intersects with DEI. Now, are we going to be able to alone say that, or should we be the ones that say the DEI shouldn't exist because it's not good for the Jews? No, DEI shouldn't exist because if it shouldn't exist because it's not good for the university, and it's not good for the pursuit of knowledge, and it's not good for the democratic values for which the United States stands and represents. And we're just a case and cause in where DEI, if it's able to exclude, and so long as it exists, I would be remiss. And by the way, it doesn't actually adversely affect. If I reclaim my Zionist identity and I reclaim indigeneity and I reclaim the capability of saying I have equal access to consistent application of whatever principles exist as a Jew/Zionist/supporter of Israel. And if I'm not able to, or I call those double standards and I expose those double standards, then there should be an understanding, a university-wide understanding of the responsibility for applying whatever rules and regulations exist equally and consistently, then that's how I work within the existing DEI infrastructure. What I think about, the conversation that I do believe universities should be having, I tell them that too. And I think that they intersect very much. I think that we are at an intersection of global processes and local processes, of which anti-Semitism is just a predictive example, if you will, of the direction in which democracies or the societies that cherish these foundational principles of life and of liberty are at a real danger.
Great, thank you. Our friend Carrie Nelson is asking a question. Let me try to, add upon it. I mean, and I think this is part of the.
First of all, I'm very humbled that Carrie Nelson is here, if I can just say.
Carrie is a good friend, and we're happy to have him as well. So Carrie is mentioning a point that, some people are making observations as time goes by that this too shall pass vis-a-vis October 7th. And you are seeing this kind of mood, especially now 100+ days since the war began, that for Israelis, as we know so well, and for those of us in the space, every day is October 7th. But the more and more time goes by, it's being watered down. Even now, you're seeing where even universities were suspending SJPs. Now they're allowing them to come back to continue to perpetuate, the same kind of narrative that they did before. And I suspect that, of course, as we get closer to the our presidential election, you're going to see a lot more of that. You're already seeing it now. Just yesterday, Rashida Tlaib and others said, we should allow Hamas members to come to the States and whatnot. What do you, again, I'm sure you don't have the optimal answer, but I mean, the question is, that sense of urgency that all of us have been seeing and observing and whatnot, how do we ensure really, to Carrie's point, that this doesn't just pass? I mean, you just can't go on from this narrative and say, we're done and didn't make a difference. As you said it from the beginning, October 7th was a game changer, but there's an attempt to go back to what was perceived to be as normal, and to forget that and to put that aside and to once again put the blame and everything once again on Israel. So, my twofold, are you seeing that more and more? And of course, how do we make sure that it doesn't disappear and October 7th does remain on the forefront as far as the consequences and everything else going forward?
So I'll share with you that when I spoke at the UN in a session that we called Never Again is Right Now, and I equated 10/7 with Kristallnacht. Meaning there is this moment where you can predict and prevent if you identify what it is that it represents. And actually, I'm most concerned about what Carrie raised, because the immediate denial, and I spoke about it, it is denial that enables the process of demonization, delegitimization, and double standards that actually are the mechanism for, not just for the Holocaust, but for genocide. Right? When you imagine what it is that enabled, it doesn't happen overnight in Rwanda or in Serbia, and of course in the Holocaust, the systematic demonization, delegitimization, double standards, the first thing that has to happen is denial. Now, whereas it took decades, not for individuals, but for the denial of the Holocaust to set in, with Kijkstra and Zundel teaching Holocaust denial in Canada in the 80s and others. It took decades for Holocaust denial to set in a social media reality, which is why it is the third front that has to be almost simultaneously confronted and demanded transparency of, with regards to, for example, not just Holocaust denial, but the intersection of 10/7 denial. It happened, as I said, as 10/7 was being perpetrated, the denial began, right? It's AI, it's not real, and so on and so on. Now, in that sense, the sense of urgency that you obviously hear in my voice, I'll share with you anecdotally. On the day, my first emergency trip to the United States, I was walking to the Holocaust Museum in Washington for a meeting there to, understand what it is that they're doing in order to be able to educate about anti-Semitism today. And by the way, that's a whole other topic, right? We're teaching only about the past. Even Holocaust curriculum, it worries me very, very, very much, because if we teach Holocaust curriculum without making accessible the mechanism, by the way, there were statements made post 10/7, not post 10/7, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day by including Antonio Guterres and I believe a foreign minister in Ireland, without mentioning the word Jew. if we enable that appropriation of the Holocaust, even in Holocaust education, of basically erasing the Jews from the Holocaust and erasing anti-Semitism from the Holocaust and erasing the meaning of anti-Semitism according to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition that enables to identify anti-Semitism comprehensively, then in fact, that concern is the gravest one. The fact that in a social media reality, denial could set in within moments, within days, within weeks, and now we're just looking at 118 days, and it's as if 10/7 never happened, and it's Israel that's again seated on the dock of the accused, instead of Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, but one proxy of a murderous regime, in a murderous Islamic regime in Iran, with other proxies alongside it. The denial piece to me is the most troubling. And of course, I don't have an answer for it, but for the fact that I know that I'm speaking to important individuals with significant voices that each have the responsibility to make sure that denial cannot set in. And I'll share the anecdotal piece. As I was walking to the Holocaust Museum, I was walking by the African American Museum. It's right there on the left. And I couldn't but think of Emmett Till and Emmett Till's mother. When I say this to younger generations, they're not sure who Emmett Till was, but the context for me was that we were about to expose what it was that happened on 10/7, the atrocities, the rape, mostly the rape, the sexual crime that would actually create this continued injury to not just to those, the victims, many of whom were brutally murdered after, but to their families. And it occurred to me that we were going to open up the casket. The state of Israel was going to open up the casket as Emmett Till's mother made the decision to open up the casket, though she knew that it would cause additional trauma to her own family, to her community, to her church. But she insisted on opening up that casket and on leaving it open. And here we were going to open up the casket. And it occurred to me that exactly what Carrie's question just was about denial would set in. And either nobody would look in the casket, or they would look in the casket and say, that's not me, that's just a Jew. And they would never look in the casket and say, that's a Jew. They deserve the very same equal and consistent application of whatever principle I deserve, of the liberal values I stand for. And here we are weeks later, and I can't tell you that that concern in the pit of my stomach has gone anywhere. It's actually very much there. The only thing that I'll say about that, and then we'll, I think, close, is, what I tell myself every day when I get up into another day of this 118th day of never ending day, to which we're all deployed, is I remind myself, and we're about to, mark or celebrate Purim. I don't know how much of a celebration it'll be. I remind myself of that first time that in ancient Persia, there was an attempt to commit genocide and to perpetrate genocide of the Jewish people. And what I remind myself is the exchange between Mordechai and Esther then. And Mordechai telling Esther, who knows if it's not for this moment that you became royalty, and Esther responding with unite all of the Jews, and not just all of the Jews, but all of us that are committed to these shared values, I would add to that. And the final thing that actually gets me going in the mornings that are very difficult is what he responds to her when Esther is petrified, and he says, if you will be silent at this moment, then salvation will come to the Jewish people from another place, and you and your father's home will be destroyed. And in many ways, I feel like we are at this intersection, not just as Jews, not just as the state of Israel, but as democracies, in which we raised generations thinking that freedom was free. But we have never had it so good when we have it so bad. So in that sense, it is the responsibility and the onus on each and every one of us as boots on the ground, proverbially and really in all of our spaces, academic, workplace, and so on, Congress, mayors, police forces, everywhere that we happen to be or that we can engage with, in order to ensure that we actually sound our voice, that we do not have the right to be silent at this moment. And that is really what guides me every single day. And I very much hope, and I know that everybody that is here and involved with SPME is right there at the forefront of this. And there are many others. So it's our moment. I mean, if we've created these infrastructures in the last however many decades, it's really for this moment in time that threatens not just the state of Israel existentially, not just the Jewish people, but the foundations of democracies everywhere, and that we have to fight for.
Right. Well, Michal, really, I know we've taken a lot of your time, and I know that these are not there are no short answers, there are no easy answers, and we appreciate everything you're doing, and obviously appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. We are partners. If we can be of any help to the work you're doing, it takes a village, and we all need to be clear about what the problems are. And obviously, there's no easy answers or easy solutions, as I said before, but we need everybody to, to have that opportunity to make sure that never again is now. So thank you again for taking the time. Thank you, Alex, as always, for joining me. And above all, I want to thank everybody else for joining us this afternoon. I know we did not get to everybody's questions, and I apologize in advance for that, but we're more than happy to answer them later on. And hopefully, Michal, you can come back at a later time and we could talk about, there's much more to talk and unpack as well. So we hope to have you back as well.
With pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.